Good afternoon. My name is Camila Tinja Capino. I am 17 years old, and in a year, I will be graduating high school at the American School of Milan. After high school, I'm planning to pursue my passion for filmmaking. I will be a Latin woman in the film industry. But I'm confident enough to say that I will get a chance to be successful and make my own films. Why? Disruption. New technologies such as social media and digital filmmaking have given it a different path to independent filmmakers, allowing them to grow and succeed in the entertainment business. This is exactly what we need in the food innovation industry. Today, our food system is in peril. We're facing different challenges such as climate change, undernourishment, obesity, and population growth. Food production today creates a significant environmental footprint. However, history has demonstrated that humans have been able to overcome similar challenges such as these ones. Using their ingenuity, they were able to develop new technologies such as genetically modified crops or new transportation methods. The same disruption and new technologies that have given me an opportunity are needed to confront these issues. For example, I believe that accelerators play a huge part of this by offering both the finance and mentoring of entrepreneurs. These entrepreneurs will be the ones to create future technologies that will help us fix these challenges that our food system is facing today. Food systems are essential to our life today. I am part of Generation C, and we apparently are more likely to become an entrepreneur than any other generation before us. By harnessing human ingenuity and to solve these problems, I believe we can make the world a better place fast enough to solve these issues. Accelerators, once again, have a huge role in this, and I look forward to hearing more. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Everyone, again, just give it up for Camilla for coming out. First, support for women in food technology. She represents that, and it's amazing to see the youth at this age, at 17. I can only imagine, by comparison, what I was doing at the time. So I'm very impressed with your work. My name is Jordan French. I'm a reporter at TheStreet.com. It's a big financial publication in New York. I've written as a journalist for a number of publications that a few of you would know, certainly TechCrunch, Tech.co, Huffington Post, Entrepreneur Magazine, Today Show, and widely cover technologies. One of my favorite areas, though, is food, not just because I love to eat it, and I think as my brother tells me, you can't trust someone if they don't love eating food. But also because it's where my business background is. I am the co-founder of a company that went through actually one of the accelerators that will join us on this panel, Plug and Play, which brings us to the topic of this panel. It's a very, very important part, cornerstone piece to the startup ecosystem, and that is the accelerator. And some of the topics we'll explore are where that genre of that ecosystem is headed. So without further delay, I want to invite over all of our esteemed panelists, which they presented to me a list of names that they promised they'd run if they want them in a certain order. Otherwise, I'll go in my own order. So first, we'll start with Andrew Ive, here with Fund SOSV. Have a seat here, Andrew. And FoodX. Matilda Ho is with us here today as well. Very good. I'll have a second seat here. Very good. And Lucia Kirchia is here, native to Italy. Pleasure having you. Have a seat. Tor Johnson. From Copenhagen. And I have just a few more. One came to us late. And let's go in. Oh, Sina Amidi Thanks so much for joining us. Sina Midi with Plug and Play. Sina is part of the reason why I'm here on this stage, his accelerator. And Renska Lind is here with us too. Thanks so much for joining us. And I think we have one more. Natalie Schmulik. Thanks for joining us, Natalie. Oh, I'm sorry, Guy. We can't forget Guy Hudson, native from Australia. Guy, a pleasure. Let's have a seat together, Guy, and let's hop right in. Get started. For those of you who got to enjoy Howard Schultz's talk, riveting man, fascinating, high emotional intelligence. On that note, one of the things that accelerators bring to the table is a lot more than just funding and mentorship. So I'm going to start with you, Guy, last and start first. What do you take from that talk with Howard that some of the things that you're implementing, you told me about, that you're implementing in your own accelerator that relate to empathy?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. As you say, Howard has a huge amount of emotional intelligence and respect for his employees. And I think we often focus a lot on customer empathy and customer engagement. But I think one of the things that Howard really brought about was the understanding of employee empathy. And we talk a lot around customer service design. And I think there's a real opportunity to think more around kind of employee experience design. The other thing that I felt was really interesting around his talk was success is better shared. We all work closely together to support not just the companies within our cohort, but the whole ecosystem. All of these accelerators are pillars of the community around food and agriculture innovation, working with corporates, working with investors, and really importantly, working with customers and farmers. And I really see, for us, a great opportunity to work more closely together, both as an industry, but also within the individual ecosystems that we aim to drive and that we aim to grow.
And Lucia, if you could grab a microphone. Lucia, I know a big part of what you do at Jellify. For those who don't know, Lucia runs Jellify. She's native to Italy here. One of the big tenets of and cornerstones of what you do is on this same trajectory, right? Like empathy, emotional intelligence. Tell us about what you're doing.
Yes, exactly. We think, in Jellify, we think that acceleration should evolve beyond, let me say, investment, that of course we need, and a simple mentorship. So we coin this term jellifications. That means that we need to help startups not just to grow, but also to scale up. So the term Jellify comes from a funny parallelism between the state of the matter and the phases of life of a typical enterprise. So you have the air, a smart idea with a good team. Okay, then you have the air becomes liquid. So you have some deals with some customers. But then if you want to become solid with a clear, sustainable growth and a clear strategic path, that's another story. That's another story. So here, from liquid to solid, you need what we call the jellifications. That means investment, of course. Okay, we need investment, but we need also what we call competencies. So we need to cover the gaps of startups, helping them to scale up, and then, number 3, access to markets. So this is something beyond mentorship that I see everywhere.
And Tor, right next to you. Tor, isn't it conventional wisdom that accelerators primarily serve purpose of funding startups? Doesn't emotional intelligence teach in the other direction, slow things down? Why is that? Why does that incongruence exist?
Well, you're absolutely right in terms of most accelerators, especially accelerators focused on startups, are based around the idea of finding funding for companies. And that was the origin of the idea, where there was Techstars and those guys kind of mastering that process. It has changed, and as some of you have already mentioned, it has become more important to think in broader perspectives, and this kind of sustainability, emotional intelligence, and other things being very important. And I think that was one of the very interesting points that Howard made this morning is the importance of the reason why. Why are you doing this? I mean, we are so focused on the what and how and for whom, and all pitches are around that. But to really make an interesting company, you need to understand the why. I mean, why are we doing this? What's the passion for it? And that is exactly what Guy was talking about. I mean, that kind of brings in the people. I mean, they can relate to that why. I mean, if you have a kind of a purpose which is broader than just money. It's a mission to do something, to change something, to have a role in society, to be a good citizen, as Howard said. That's very, very important. And really, that's one of the key secrets to success of growth. I mean, to have that sense of purpose, because it's not just having a cool solution or knowing the market. You really need to have this as a sense of purpose and where you want to go with it.
Definitely, and Natalie, on that note, at the hatchery you've incubated, and forgive me, no pun intended, number of successful companies. But to Tor's point, is there more to the accelerator's role than just making money?
Yeah, absolutely. We are a nonprofit, so we're not in the business of making money, which certainly helps us. And we have a lot of major fiscal sponsors, including large consumer packaged goods organizations like Kellogg Company and Conagra and Griffith Foods. And what we've seen is that these large companies, similar to what Howard said, they realize they have quite a bit of social responsibility and they want to make change and they want to start investing in the startups and entrepreneurs that are really going to make the change that we see will come forward tomorrow and in the future. And one thing that we value is community. Community is the foundation of who we are and what we're all about. Community both in the sense of the entrepreneurs that we work with. We connect with them, we speak their language, we try to find ways to help them in any way we can. But also the community we're moving into. We're building a new incubator and manufacturing facility on the west side of Chicago, which is a very underserved community. It has the highest unemployment rate. It's a food desert. And we chose this area of Chicago because we can see an opportunity to make change within this particular area. We find that the food and beverage industry in particular have the lowest barriers of entry, where you can come from all walks of life, any education level, and you can find opportunities in this industry. And so within building this new facility, we're building a 67,000 square foot food and beverage manufacturing space that'll house between 75 to 100 food and beverage companies. And we're predicting 900 new jobs will be created within the first 5 years of opening. So it's really about what we are doing for the community and what the community will be doing for us that creates our mission and our goal moving forward.
Thanks for that. And Sina, one of the things that Natalie touched upon is really interesting is the push from enterprise. And again, you know, most would suspect that their drive to partner with early stage startups would be purely financial, perhaps even more sinister, to pirate intellectual property. But you found with over large numbers of enterprises that you partner with, that's not the case. Tell us about that.
So we currently partner with 250 corporations in all industries. And what Plug and Play is trying to do is to get rid of the friction in between these two parties. The entrepreneur does need help. The entrepreneur does have a lot of hurdles to go over, and our goal is to grease some of those hurdles. So working with people like Tyson in Chicago, which is one of your partners, as well as ExxonMobil, we have to get both parties on the same page in order to enable them to innovate faster.
And Rinsky, right next to you. On that topic, we touched on enterprise. Government plays a role too. Is that right?
Absolutely, particularly in the food system. We actually got our start at a meeting that was called by the California Governor's Office that was held at a venture capitalist office. So in fact, although we tend to think about government and policy being lagging indicators of change, certainly government plays a huge role in supporting innovation and entrepreneurship. We have a number of active partners across both federal agencies, state agencies, and local agencies that play a really important role in helping scale some of the startups that we work with. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and on that note, as it relates to value systems, and I want to stay on that topic and right back to you with it. What are you hearing from the California State Office or at the federal level in terms of directives, things that they want you to push towards?
Sure. I'll speak to my home state of California and on the behalf of the California Department of Food and Agriculture that has put out a pretty aggressive mandate both on supporting the health of our soils. I'm sure at some point during the course of this 4 days, we'll hear a lot about how much we need to be focused on soil health, soil fertility, and the potential for agriculture to play a role in drawing down carbon. So California has put an enormous amount of resources in incentivizing production practices that can help support soil health. So that's one huge area. Also, food waste. I know that we're going to be hearing a lot about food waste. It is a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, and the state of California, along with a number of other state governments, have made significant regulations around the reporting of food waste, and so that's going to create a whole host of opportunities for innovators to come in with some of the solutions that are ultimately going to be required by these levels of government.
And thanks for that. So Matilda Ho is here with us. She had probably one of the longest flights coming in from Shanghai by way of, I can imagine, only a few cities. China is always an interesting topic, and we'll definitely touch on it a lot more later. But narrowly on instructions that you've received or any directives, where do non-financial goals sit in the stack with your accelerator?
Right. I think a lot of people would challenge about what's going to disrupt in China for food innovation, but we all are very aware of the challenges that we see here for the future of food for China. With 20% of the world population, but only has 7% of arable land. And 20% of those arable lands is being toxic. So how China is going to feed its global population is going to be a very important issue for us. And the way that we really see to have this food tech accelerator platform is also to echo what Natalie mentioned before, that we're here to foster a community and ecosystem of people. I think a lot of people ignore the fact that the way we grow, harvest, consume, and share with each other, it's very important that it's a community effort, both done in the local village level and also at a scale of global economy. And we really wanted to use this venture capital platform to be able to foster the innovation and work with farmers and scientists to investors to executives from food corporation and to be able to support the entrepreneurs to accelerate the good food future. And that's why we're here. Only to foster the innovation, not from the China, but also beyond.
And thanks for that, Matilda. And Andrew, last but not least, and I'll drop a good one with you. Are we running out of land?
Are we running out of land?
Yes.
I don't know. Are we running out of land?
This is a question to you on the topic of sustainability, other goals, and agriculture in particular. Right. Do we have what we need to survive as a population?
I think we do. I think there's a number of issues we face. I think we face an issue of waste. From what I understand, a lot of the waste occurs actually at the end of at the consumer end of the supply chain, where we have refrigerators filled with food, and we've gone to the supermarket, we bought what we wanted, we have it all in the refrigerator, and then we go to the supermarket again in 2 or 3 days' time because we want something additional. And then we circle back to the refrigerator and we find things that are expiring or not quite as fresh as when we purchased them, and we trash them. So I think something like 20% of the food that we waste is actually at the consumer end of things. We also waste at the front end of things, where the supermarket and the grocery stores are selecting very specific items based on whether they're pretty enough, whether they have the right cylindrical effects and so on. Because for some reason the grocery stores believe that consumers will purchase fruits and vegetables and other produce that are perfect looking and are not slightly different. So we're finding that people at the farm level are actually encouraged to pick certain products and to put them into the system, and to actually leave other products which are slightly odd looking, or as they're called, ugly in the US, and take those products and leave them on the field to just waste over time. Example of bananas, 50% of the bananas actually grown, only 50% get to the consumer. And of that 50% that ultimately gets to the consumer, a big chunk of those don't get eaten because they go black because they're sitting on kitchen counters for a certain length of time. So I think there's enough. I think we're just poorly handling the food that we have. And that's in perhaps the Western world. In other countries around the world, I think we could say that there are cases where there's not enough. But it's a matter of supply chain and distribution more than it is production, I think.
And on that note, Andrew, you're running FoodX, largest accelerator in North America in the food space. SOSV is what backs you. Are you seeing investment opportunities in that space?
We've had a number of companies coming through. I mean, we get about 1,000 companies a year applying to FoodX from around the world. About 20-30% of those are from North America, and the rest of those companies are from literally around the world. I would say about 10, 15, 20% of those are tackling waste and sustainability in one way or another.
Great, and back to you, Lucia. Your neighbors in France have marketed their propensity to either reuse or give away grocery store produce. Are you witnessing a similar effect throughout other parts of Central and Southern Europe?
Yes, I've seen that it represents a sort of trend, actually. But I would say, in general, new business model and new technologies habilitating a better use of resources. Honestly, I totally agree with you. I don't know whether we have or we don't have a production issues, but for sure, I'm with you, we have a supply chain issue. For example, I have seen many disruptive technology coming out for food freshness detection that can totally change the supply chain from companies to restaurants and to also our, let me say, leaves. So that's also a trend that can habilitate tomorrow new business model in the area that you mentioned.
And Tor, next question to you. On a very similar topic, do you see as a shared view, somewhat globally, that the EU leads in food waste reduction? Tor?
Is that true? Or?
Yes.
Yeah, I think EU has been doing some really interesting stuff in food waste and trying to kind of come up with ideas and ways to kind of decrease that. And Denmark, which we have our kind of accelerator, the growth train, is actually a leading country in Europe on that. And they be very, very much focused on sustainability and all those issues regarding food waste. And they're one of in the forefront. And that is all about community. As we come back to our initial talk here with Howard, that to kind of create new innovations in food and also in health is about sometimes creating community around it, and there needs to be a lot of people involved in that. So I think that kind of the atmosphere and the perspective or the perceptions in Denmark have always been very much for the environment and for sustainability. So that has made it possible kind of to introduce that kind of ideas and that kind of focus on sustainability, which is somewhat now being translated into the European Union also.
And Guy, if we can grab you a microphone. You face some particularly interesting issues. You're surrounded by more water than any of us. Is there anything else that we can all learn from where you sit, maybe some issues that you've had to face first before other countries do on this topic of sustainability and how an accelerator fits into that architecture?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. For us, sustainability is a key issue, as you'd expect, and in some ways we are feeling the effects of climate change more profoundly and earlier than a lot of other nations. So when we talk about soil health and we talk about water management, we have spent many, many years evolving our systems to be able to do this more effectively. I think when it comes to transforming markets around sustainability, ultimately the most important thing will be the consumer and the consumer's demand for high quality produce. So in Australia, being on the doorstep of Asia and a lot of our produce getting exported to Asia, we see a requirement for much more closer connections through the market. So we'll see an evolution away from traceability just being a marketing message, telling the consumer something nice about the farmer, but more about how can we look at the whole value chain and investigate where are those drops in efficiency, where are we seeing more waste, where are we not able to support a more sustainable ecosystem for food production as a whole. At Spark Labs Cultivate, one of our cohorts is a company called Ripe.io, who are working really hard at helping to squeeze every piece of efficiency out of the supply chain, not just because of the ability to increase the value for those involved in that supply chain, but also to be able to improve the sustainability in the long run of that chain.
And on the note to Rinsky, I do want to unpack this more. Just optically, California has always been seen as a leader. Certainly, Silicon Valley traditionally, Santa Monica and the Los Angeles area has picked up a lot of slack too. That said, for those who don't know, is a given treatise between Nevada and Las Vegas and Los Angeles. If you look at the water table and the quantities of water that Las Vegas use, it's perhaps around the 3% mark relative to Los Angeles. Along the lines of these incongruencies, where does California sit now in terms of its ability to lead on a lot of the issues that we face in sustainability?
Great, thank you. It's a great question. I also think it's important to note California will be the host of the Global Climate Action Summit, which is a really impressive global effort to really bring together some of the leaders, thought leaders and change makers in the space. I think where California has the opportunity to lead is one of the most exciting, I think, elements of working in the food system, which is also one of the most challenging, is the relationship that every part of the food system has to another part. So we, for example, are really looking for the kinds of innovators and startups that can have multiple opportunities for impact. So they could either be disrupting multiple industries or create an impact. So I give you an example. Imperfect Produce is, in this keeping with the theme of food waste, is a company that is connecting consumers to ugly, otherwise imperfect food product that would be wasted otherwise and delivering it to their doors, which is a healthier, lower cost alternative. So I think there's a dual impact there. One of our portfolio companies is Full Cycle Bioplastics. They're taking food waste and turning it into a bioplastic alternative that is completely compostable and biodegradable. So again, I think there's an opportunity for taking a more systems-based approach, and I think that California in particular has an opportunity to lead on that. We've got some of the nation's largest farms, as well as have been leading on the farm-to-table movement, and then the intersection of technology there. I think operating at that nexus is where I believe California has an opportunity to take a leadership role.
And Natalie, I want to ask you this one. Do people really want to eat ugly fruit?
If they don't know it's ugly, yes. I think right now everybody wants to eat all food. And I think what's amazing that we see with the entrepreneurs we work with are their innovation around how to transform food that is equally nutritious, it's just as good for you, it has so many different applications. It tastes just as good. It just has something that's considered maybe imperfect, but that's where we see this movement of upcycling. We're hearing the word upcycling come up quite often right now, and that's really this idea of taking something that is just as perfect as if it had looked like something else, but transforming it into something that we deem more edible. We see that, for example, with alternate forms of protein like cricket flour. I think there's a company here today, and then we have a bunch of different companies throughout the US who are trying to utilize cricket flour. Now, the North American market might not be as comfortable with eating a whole cricket, so we're transforming it into something that we deem more appetizing. What's interesting is we see so many companies that are either transforming these ugly or imperfect foods into juices. Barnana very successfully right now took the bananas that would otherwise be wasted in Brazil and dehydrated them, transformed them into a fuel snack, and they're doing extremely well in the industry. They're internationally distributed. We see companies that are also taking products, for example, in the land of coffee, we see coffee cherries right now that are actually being transferred into a type of tea because they're high in antioxidants. They found the coffee cherries were being discarded so that we could just get the coffee bean, and that was a really fantastic source of food and nutrition as well. So I think the market is absolutely excited and demanding the use of these products. I think it's a matter of accessibility and education and just knowing that this food is good for you. And I think we're starting to see that shift even in things like changing expiration date to best before. So understanding that it doesn't necessarily mean it's gone bad, it's still edible, it's still nutritious. So we're shifting the language, and I think language will play a very valuable role. When we call something ugly, we naturally don't want to lean towards it. Whereas if we transform it and we say it's upcycled and it's nutritious and valuable, then we're more apt to want to consume it and we're more excited about it. And we see brands doing a phenomenal job with things like this.
Thanks for that. And same question to you, Matilda. Is ugly food just a fad? And how does that play in mainland China?
Yeah, in my other venture, online farmers market, we actually, one of our best-selling items, we called it ugly banana. So it's a chemical-free wild banana grown in the back village of Hainan Island. And because it's so ugly, because it's wildly grown, so we called it ugly, and we have ugly apple, we have ugly oranges, and it just takes a lot of consumer education to tell people why. And on our platform, we never talk about we're just selling food for your functional need. We tell you about where the food comes from. We tell you where the farmers are harvesting those products. And then that actually create a value, an additional value on top of the original product they just eat in their mouth. So food waste has been a very growing issue, and upcycling, we're actually receiving a lot of applications locally from China, thinking about how to upcycle a lot of our agricultural waste into more valuable products. So definitely echo the same trend. We're definitely supporting that.
And on that note, same question to you. Besides fruit and produce, what else could we upcycle?
Smart packaging is also a very growing trend right now that we're starting to see a lot of biodegradable, reusable packaging that can really help to save and reserve the food for a longer time. So that's another startup field that we're starting to see more and more often.
Thanks. And, Andrew, did you want to weigh in?
I was just going to a couple of things on the upcycling side. One, we invest in a company called Rise, and what Rise does is it takes spent grain from the brewing process, and there's literally millions and millions of tons of spent grain that's used in the brewing process, and because it attracts fungi very, very quickly, usually it's put into a landfill. And that's generally what happens in the US. In some places in Europe, if it's close to farms, then it's used as a feed for pigs and so on. But what one company has done is it's taken that often landfilled product, and it has its own process to convert that spent grain into a flour. And that flour is high in fiber, it's high in protein, and it's low in carb. Which means, you know, it's very on trend in terms of a flour. It's almost a super flour. In addition, for example, aquafaba. There's a company called Fora Foods, for example, which is taking the water and the kind of fiber off of the garbanzo bean or the chickpea and turning it into a vegan-style butter mixed with coconut oil and so on. It looks like butter, it tastes like butter, it's an amazing product, but it's actually a derivative of what is considered a waste product from the chickpea product. So in other words, upcycling isn't just ugly fruit. It's also taking the kind of derivative of an existing successful production cycle and using those derivatives that were often either flushed into rivers or put into landfills and converting them into something useful.
Speaking of something useful on a very derivative topic, Sina, you've been around the world. I know your main office, of course, is in Sunnyvale, California for Plug and Play, but you have Amsterdam as well. You've seen a lot of the differences. What are the differences, the main ones, in terms of appetite for new or, let's say, new foods that might be consumed often elsewhere, but not so much until recently stateside?
So before I answer that, I wanted to touch on where I see change coming from. And I think one of the key messages that we've heard from this panel today is entrepreneurs are the people that are driving change. I've worked with 250 corporations. They all say they want sustainability, but they want it at equal cost or less cost of what they're currently paying, and they won't do anything else. Governments, on the other hand, are trying to increase costs to force you to go more sustainable. So those are the two other parties that are involved. But the entrepreneur has come up with so many things to help you become more sustainable, to enable you to become sustainable. Us as accelerators are all here in order to help the entrepreneur. But we do need to empower these entrepreneurs in order to make those changes. Now, for your question, I've seen that our consumers are ready for change, but only if it is just as convenient, if not more convenient, than what's currently happening. I've tried imperfect foods. The food you get is great, it tastes the same, but it comes once a week, and it's not the same thing. The average American goes to the grocery store 2.8 times a week, and they do waste 20% of the food after they buy it. But what if I can get my food delivered in 30 minutes? Then I never have to go to the grocery store. Then the grocery doesn't waste food, and I don't waste food. So I think there is an appetite, but people are lazy, and lazy people are not going to become more sustainable.
And Tor, right over to you. Do you see the same effect in the EU? Do you see the appetites, in fact, are different?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting about ugly fruit is it's kind of a metaphor for startups in many ways. I mean, it's not that many years ago since where people just, when they talked about startups, they're like, look, what? You want to do startups? That's the most stupid thing ever. I mean, that has changed. That has changed, and in some ways, the role of accelerator, as we were talking about that, is to shape these kind of startups up and kind of build a community around them, because it is key to kind of be a successful fruit, and even ugly fruit, which is the new beauty, is to kind of work together, to co-create and to understand the opportunities. And yes, I think there is a taste for new things, and there is a taste for innovation. And we can't forget, which we very often do in the kind of the Nordic countries and maybe well-established countries, that there are always two goals that all organizations need to have in mind. And there's the same goals that governments need to have in mind. One is about kind of making the most of what you already have. And kind of exploiting the things that you have, which we are great at. A lot of nations, a lot of organizations are great at exploiting what they have, making the most out of the machine and so forth. But then the other side is innovation. You always need to have these two things, even in established corporations. And we're seeing that today, that talking about ugly fruits, because a couple of years ago, when you talked about startup lingo to larger organization, and I guess even maybe Howard isn't a good example because he's kind of an entrepreneur. But when you talk to them, that was like speaking another lingo to them, and they didn't understand this. Now they all understand this. They understand the importance of innovation. They understand that by creating new things, creating new ways to do things, creating new purpose and business model, that will move people and that will create new tastes and new opportunities. So it's something that needs to be co-created with entrepreneurs and the community, and that's how we kind of change consumer.
And thanks for that. On this note of innovation, to you, Rensky, this is a particularly interesting and sometimes very California topic. A lot of people do see localization and being a locavore as innovation, but that's not necessarily a good thing. Can you explain why or why not?
Sure. And as a former proponent of local and regional food systems, I think I have a particularly interesting vantage point on this. We absolutely think that there is a really critical role for local food systems to play in sustaining communities and regional economies. But in terms of innovation, I actually remember sitting down with my co-founder, who's a VC in Silicon Valley, and he said, let's talk about this local thing. Like, why? Why local? And so I started with my sort of, I've spent 3 years building this. It's really important for farmers. It's really important for consumers and communities. And he's like, but why? I'm like, well, there are economic imperatives and, really kind of the fabric of community that are connected to local and regional food sheds. But the other part of it that's really important is transparency and traceability. And his immediate response was, well, aren't there so many other ways that you can achieve those goals? So when you think about it at scale, and we think about the global food system, there's unquestionably a role for, and this is, all of us to some degree or another are interfacing with the kinds of technologies and innovations that are allowing us to have greater transparency and more traceability all throughout the supply chain. And there are, we could spend a whole more than 17 more minutes talking about some of those enabling technologies. So I think it's just thinking about what is the innovation and what is it that you're interested in solving for. We have one company in our portfolio that's called Milk Run. They're operating out of the Portland marketplace, and they actually are working within the local and regional food system, but they're driving more value back to the farmers that has typically been extracted through the value chain process. So that is an innovation that is connected to the local food systems. I think it's, from my perspective, it's always thinking about what are we solving for? Like, what are our overall objectives and what are the goals and the characteristics of innovation that are going to help us get to those goals?
And on this topic, Guy, I know you work with a number of farmers that also import and export. Your perspective?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Actually, I think combining these two things is kind of an interesting perspective. So we're all seeing many startups going global much, much earlier. And we're seeing the growth of local, but actually there is a huge potential in being able to bridge cultural conversations around food. So Matilda will be able to speak to this, but in Asia, the conversation is much less about sustainability to the consumer, but much more around safety. So what's safe food? What's the best food that I can buy to keep my family healthy and safe? And in Australia, for many years, we've been seen as a clean, green producer of food by Asia. And as technology is coming into to the market that is helping people not just to hear that message, but also to deeply be able to understand it right through the value chain, businesses are coming up which are having to not just say these things, but prove them. So there's a brilliant young Australian company called James Tyler, who are doing an amazing job at providing that translation layer, not around local food, not about sending a couple of miles down the road, but actually by directly connecting Australian farmers with Chinese consumers. They can now deliver directly to over 40 Chinese cities and pass fresh produce, milk, dairy, others, straight to those Chinese consumers. And I think we've all become incredibly focused on the miles that our food is traveling, but to Renska's point, it is actually really around how can we provide the most sustainable path for the food that we're producing, wherever it's coming from, and how can we find the most efficient market to do that?
And thanks for adding on that. I do want to weigh in too, though. Chef Jose Andres told me after he asked for a raise of hands, how many of you eat local? And nearly everyone gleefully raised their hands. And his response was, you're killing people. And a bit hyperbolic, right? But from a number of chefs' point of view, and we'll go to you next, Natalie, on this subject. Their view, though, is in some cases that some of the best quality foods get imported, for example, from Italy or the UK or from the mainland, and that's really where those things should come from. And perhaps in Chicago, you don't want someone trying to grow Japanese cucumber. Your take on this?
So I think it's interesting. I think both of your points are exactly right. I think it's a bigger subject. It's not just about local, because when we think of local, it can mean so many different things. We actually have a member company in Chicago called Here. They produce cold pressed juices, dips, and salad dressings, and their mission is to use 30% local ingredients, locally sourced ingredients throughout the Midwest. And they have a challenge, because if they're going to grow, what does local mean? Does here mean just the Midwest? Does here mean Chicago? Does here mean the US? So they have to think about that in terms of production, distribution. And so it's a much bigger subject, and it's also just, we have various definitions of what local means. When we started our project, we initially thought we're only there to support local entrepreneurs, local Chicago entrepreneurs, but we started to receive calls and inquiries from entrepreneurs throughout the world who were looking for a support center, who were looking for a production space, and we quickly transitioned into also providing a landing place where companies from around the world can actually introduce their products to the US market through Chicago. So right now we actually have a trade center on site where we work with companies. We work with the British consulate, we work with Canadian consulate, and they'll actually come to us and bring 20 entrepreneurs who are ready to export into the US market, and they will come visit our space. We'll talk to them about changes and challenges they may face in a different market, how to appeal to a different consumer, and we'll actually guide them through the process and look at potentially providing them with a production space when they're ready to move their production into the US market. So right now we've actually been able to accommodate a lot of entrepreneurs throughout the world who want to come in and introduce their products. We also see that with different forms of technology. We see a lot of hydroponics and aquaponics facilities. Indoor growing has become increasingly popular. And so it may sometimes be the case where you're introducing a foreign crop and showcasing it to a new market, and chefs certainly love experimenting and trying to transform their dishes with unique ingredients. But I do think there's possibility for everything. I think the conversation between countries and trying to break down those barriers is beneficial for everybody, because we can all learn from each other. And I think getting good, sustainable produce throughout the world is going to achieve more than just trying to make sure we're only producing and supplying a small circumference.
And Sina, on the same note, what has globalization become in food and its intersection with technology? Are we moving away from a world that's like chocolate, where there are idiosyncratic differences in the flavors, and more towards, gum, where it might be a lot more universal?
So I think the food world is universal, and it's become universal over the last 30 years. Now I think we're moving away from that and going into like the idea of maybe my cucumber that's Persian, which is what we are and what I am, and then what's an American cucumber would taste different, and that's what's changing. And I personally don't agree at all with localization. I believe that the traceability aspect of localization is what's important, not actually, having one skyscraper in every city that's farming for you. It's still would run out. It doesn't make sense. One other thing I do want to tell the audience, and it's a little bit off topic, I'm sorry, is look how many accelerators are out here, like up on stage. There are so many accelerators for corporations and for startups to use. And we are not, the same as a bank account or the same as an insurance company. It's not just a check mark. If you have an accelerator program, make sure that they are right for you, and maybe one isn't enough. You can come to us if you want corporate introductions, or you can go to Guy if you need help in Australia, or if you need help in Chicago. But every accelerator gives something different to their startups, and it's not one that will make the difference, it's us as an ecosystem.
Yasina, we're certainly listening to that, and we'll dovetail right in. In fact, there's a great question for you, Lucio, with one of the newer accelerators. How are you differentiating yourself?
Yes, first of all, I'm totally with you. Actually, before answering to your question, we have to be honest. We have to be honest. There are fantastic startups everywhere putting on our table fantastic ideas. Probably they have some gaps, of course. They are in early stage, but there is a great potential there. On the other side, we have consolidated companies, small, big corporations, who understood that open innovation exists. And they're trying to look for solutions from these startups. And you know, they discover that solutions from startups are not ready, are not already packed, okay, to be used. Come on, guys. They are startups. It's structural. And this is exactly the frustration that we were having a conversation about it before. It is not just about investment. It is not just about mentoring startups. It's also about making really open innovation happens. That it is about creating a real partnership between corporation and startup. It is not only about acquisition. Come on. Because this is usually the typical approach. I was the CIO of a bigger corporation, okay? And usually the typical approach is, okay, if I like the startup, I buy. And it's good sometimes not. Sometimes it is about partnering with them, building a project together. So I think that the evolution of acceleration is making this partnership finally happen, moving beyond M&A. I'm not against M&A, but it is not always feasible because I can be a big corporation. I can find in a startup a potential new supplier for my business. And again, we are speaking about food, but it is not only for food companies. If we speak about sustainable solution, it is for every single company. Every single company should have an environmental sustainable strategy. That's the point. So sorry, I don't want to speak about Jellify. I mean, I would like to point out this big gap that we have. It is there in the ecosystem. Plug and Play, Jellify, all accelerators are trying to do a piece, but we need to trust to do something together there. Otherwise, we will always live with this gap.
Thanks for that. And it's great to hear about your success so far too. Andrew, with one of the oldest pure play food accelerators, how do you stay relevant?
So, how do we stay relevant? I think there's a number of ways. We've got a very open system. And what that means is we're getting, as I said before, about 1,000 applicants from around the world, from entrepreneurs, very young companies, who are bringing the most amazing ideas and companies to us. And we need that aha moment that we get, and that kind of prickle down your back that you get when you read an idea or you read about a company or a group of people who are doing something that's going to change things and are going to make a big difference. And when you get that prickle, when you get that, oh my goodness, this is amazing, this is a big, big idea, you grab hold of it and you do everything you can to help them. And in terms of that open innovation I mentioned right at the beginning, we plug into different mentors from all sorts of from organizations, from government, from academia. We grab smart people with a lot to add to these companies, and we try and fit them in and help each of the companies to achieve what they need to achieve. We don't have a specific curriculum that we're forcing on top of 10 different companies every cohort, because they are completely different. they're in different businesses, in different industries. They're trying to do different things. They've got different stages. The teams are various. So you can't overlay a curriculum on top of these different companies and expect them to be successful, which means we have to tailor every single cohort to each and every company. It's a very individualized effort, and therefore everything's fresh. There's no standard. And to Ben's point, innovation, I find innovation is local. We're getting applicants, for example, and not on a city level, but from a country perspective. So, for example, we're seeing a lot of innovation around traceability and around food testing coming from Asia. And I think that's because the entrepreneurs in that market are seeing those as some of the biggest challenges that need fixing. In North America, for example, we're seeing a lot of innovation around waste because we waste a lot. We're seeing innovation around simplification of food because the US is the home of processed, over-engineered food, and there's a desire to go back to simplicity and a desire to go back to kind of simple processes. Canada is producing some of the most amazing agricultural innovation, whether it's around satellite imagery and analysis of finding diseases at the square foot level using satellite imagery, or whether it's soil testing through techniques. So there's a lot of localized innovation. The only thing I would take umbrage at, given some of the conversations that have been going on, is I find innovation is ageless. I'm finding a lot of people innovating who are not young. They are young-minded, they are young-spirited, and they're fresh, but sometimes they're 70 years old. And I'm also finding it's genderless. So 50% of our companies are female and 50% are male. It's not a man-oriented business, and it's not a young-oriented business.
That was wonderful. Really appreciate that, Andrew. And Matilda, I'm really interested in your take.
I think I would say that we at Bits and Bytes take a very focused approach on really trying to foster innovation for China. So we do accept application from all over the world, but we only invest in portfolio companies that really see China as one of their key priority market. That's where we have our local mentor network, domain experts, companies that can help to really help the companies to go beyond the proof of concept stage and really show some tangible next steps. So an example is we invested in a company called Bella Pupa. It's actually an Italian startup trying to come to China, and we helped them to create the first healthy snack out of silkworm flour, a byproduct of the silk industry, as a more sustainable animal protein ingredient. So we do trying to help more and more startups, no matter where they're from, but they really want to see an opportunity and a better food products or services that could be implemented in China and stay relevant. So I think for the earlier point, I do think that more and more startups that we see that have a better chance of success would have to have an international-minded perspective, but also trying to be locally relevant into their culture. I think that's the value proposition that in each startup, when we invest in, that's the value that we're trying to help them to co-create together.
And Guy, I want to make sure you had a chance to weigh in here.
Yeah, I think to the points that are being made, and Sina, you said it very well, and we all have our own specific nuances to the programs that we deliver, whether it's deep insight into Chinese culture, whether it's looking more at kind of being able to adapt to a more mature kind of sustainability-minded Californian consumer. For us, we focused a lot on the farming side of things. So we have access to 13,000 hectares of experimental farmland. Now, across all of us, we all have specific things, and the startups today have such a brilliant array of potential support to be able to help them in their growth journey. We all work together and happily kind of refer businesses amongst ourselves to be able to make sure that those businesses get the very best support from the best program for them. And I think that's incredibly important as we look to the future, whether it's us working together and supporting, sharing teams and sharing opportunities, or whether it's just us making sure that the one who is most suited to each individual business is being attached to that startup.
And Rinsky, I want to make sure I'll give you the final note.
Great. Okay, so on this topic?
Yep.
Great. Yeah. So again, just to echo a little bit of what Sina said, and what everybody has said, we all have very different value propositions that we offer the startups that we work with, and I think we absolutely maintain a very collaborative relationship with a number of others in the ecosystem. We're all relatively confined to the time and the duration that's associated with our programs. And I think it's, we give this advice all the time to entrepreneurs. Like, you really need to make sure that you're doing your diligence on not just your accelerator, but also your investors. Like, you really want to understand who it is that you are building partnerships with, and what is it that they're in it for? Like, what is their overall objective, and what are they looking to do and create, and who's in their ecosystem, and how can that be valuable for you at a particular stage in your own trajectory as an entrepreneur?
And a wonderful note to end on. That speaks for our time. My name is Jordan French. Again, thanks so much to our esteemed panel here today. Great. Until next time.